Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Welcome to the Erickson Report. I'm your host. My name's Larry Erickson, and for the next almost half hour, I'm going to be talking about some things that I hope you will find interesting. Any reactions to the show can be sent to me directly. My personal email is whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com, or you can go to my website, which is called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. You get the email address from there if you missed it, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather do it that way. If you do send me email, as always, two requests. One, include something in the subject line that makes it clear it's about the show, it's not spam. And two, be a little patient about getting an answer. So with that, let's get to it. We're going to start with a quick follow-up on something I mentioned last time, that Puerto Rico was still waiting for billions of dollars in aid authorized by Congress for reconstruction and relief in the wake of Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017. It seems that Tweety Pie has finally been pressured enough that on January 15th he released some $16 billion of that aid, but only with conditions attached that appear intended to sabotage the ongoing relief effort. For one, there's a ban on paying Puerto Rico's minimum wage, which is $15 an hour, on projects the federal money funds. And what's more, none of the money can be used to aid in repairing the island's power grid. Laughably, these are claimed to be anti-corruption measures because, yes, of course, paying the local minimum wage is corrupt. So even after they ran out of stalls, the white supremacists populating the White House still look for ways to make it hard for Puerto Rico to fully recover. As Hunter, a staff writer at Daily Kos, put it, the reasons for these acts can only be speculated on, but are not in the slightest hard to imagine. All right, moving on. Something we have not talked about in a while is the economy, but I want to now because there's been a welcome development in how we discuss the issue and how we regard the issue. And that development is an increasing awareness of how the ways in which we have regarded our economic health, the ways in which we have measured our national economic health are flawed, they have failed us, and they have for some time. I mean, look, this is what we're told, okay? The stock market's doing fine, GDP is up, the number of jobs is growing, the economy's booming. What's not to like? Okay, here's what's not to like. According to a study this past fall by the Brookings Institution, 55 million American workers aged 18 to 64, representing 44% of the workforce, qualify as low wage. Their median hourly wages are $10.22, and their median annual earnings are about $18,000. 44% of Americans are in low-wage jobs. That study, and others like it, are going beyond the old standards of looking at the unemployment numbers and the numbers of jobs, and are asking the question, okay, but what kind of jobs? What sort of jobs are they? Not that many decades ago, I mean, certainly at the time I was entering the full-time workforce, it was reasonable to assume, or at the very least, it was not unreasonable to assume that someone working full-time year-round would make enough to support a family, or at the very, very least, get by. That simply is no longer true, and has not been true for some time. And the research and the numbers are there to back that up. There's a new standard of measurement. It's called the Jobs Quality Index, or the JQI. What that does is it takes each month's jobs report from the Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, and determines the extent to which the number of jobs is weighted toward more desirable, higher wage, longer hour jobs, and away from less desirable, low wage, shorter hour jobs. As such, the JQI serves as a proxy for the overall health of the American economy and the American jobs market. And its graph of the trend since 1990 clearly demonstrates an overall decline in job quality, what means is an increasing number of crappy jobs that do more to benefit corporate profit and the 1%, compared to good jobs that could benefit people and support families. In the words of Dan Alpert, an investment banker and Cornell Law School professor who helped design the JQY, quoting, "The problem is that the quality of the stock of jobs on offer has been deteriorating for the last 30 years. And let's just dump once and for all the notion, the lie that those low-wage jobs are all just first or entry-level jobs for teenagers or new grads. That also is not true, and again has not been true for some time. That Brookings Institution study that I mentioned notes that 30% of low-wage workers live in families with annual earnings no more than 150% of the poverty line. 26% of low-wage workers are the only earners in their families, getting by an annual median annual earnings of about $20,000. And an additional 25% live in families in which all workers earn low wages, with the median family earnings of about $42,000. What's more, according to 538.com, in the 1990s, 1/5 of minimum wage workers were still earning minimum wage a year later. That is now up to 1/3 of minimum wage workers. And of those who do make more, 2/3 of those are making no more than 10% above minimum wage. Put that together, it means that nearly 80% of minimum wage workers will be making no more than 10% above minimum wage a year later. And what's more and more people are getting stuck at that level, working minimum wage for years on end. And it's not just low-wage workers who are getting nowhere. Bankrate's Financial Security poll reported that in 2018, 62% of American workers didn't get a raise the entire year. In 2019, 51% got no raise the entire year. And the overall picture is no better. The BLS reported on January 14th that real average hourly earnings increased just 0.6% in 2019, but that combined with a 0.6% reduction in the length of the average work week, which together means that people got nowhere at all. Indeed, that sort of wage stagnation is also of long standing. Joseph Stiglitz, former chief economist at the World Bank, notes that real median weekly earnings are just barely above what they were when Tweety Pie took office, and the median wage of a full-time male worker is still more than 3% below what it was 40 years ago. 40 years of effort to wind up behind where you were. People already understand this. They may not know the numbers, but they know it in their gut. They know it in their daily experiences. That's why in a recent poll, over 70% of Americans supported a federal jobs guarantee for the unemployed. That's why the Pew Research Center can report that 70% of American adults say our economic system unfairly favors large corporations and the rich. And that's why a Harris poll earlier this year found that 40% of voters and 55% of women 18 to 54 said they would prefer to live in a socialist country, socialist here being defined as a nation providing universal health care, tuition-free education, and a decent day's wage for a decent day's work. American workers know they're getting screwed. We've known it for a long time. Now, finally, the experts are catching up. All right, moving on now to our regular segment, 2 weeks of stupid, clowns and outrages. And we start, as usual, with the clowns. Our second runner-up for the Clown Award this time is the administration of Whitefield Academy, a private Christian school in Louisville, Kentucky. Kayla Kenny turned 15 in December, and her mother organized a party with a few friends and family at a local restaurant, for which she also got a cake from a local bakery, requesting one with colors that pop. It turned out that the cake's rainbow motif mirrored the design on Kayla's sweatshirt, which was enough for Whitefield Academy to expel her, writing in a dismissal letter that the photo, quote, demonstrates a posture of morality and cultural acceptance contrary to that, unquote, of the reactionary school's outdated, outmoded, and bigoted philosophy. Now, and subsequently, there's been a lot of fuss and feathers about is Kayla LGBTQ or not, about supposed previous problems at the school, but one thing remains unaltered by all of that. For the administration of Whitefield Academy, not only can't you be LGBTQ, you can't even look LGBTQ, and that clearly makes them clowns. Our first runner-up is MSNBC, and in particular, weekend anchor Joy Ann Reid. Now, you undoubtedly know about the kerfuffle between Liz Warren and Bernie Sanders. On that matter, personally, I'll just say that I don't think either one of them handled it very well, because neither one at any point raised the possibility that this was just a genuine misunderstanding. Reid, however, went totally wonko. On January 18th, she had on a body language expert, and let's note, this is not an actual thing, but she had on a self-proclaimed body language expert named Janine Driver to claim, without challenge, that based on eye level and the turtling of his shoulders, that it was clear Sanders lied when he denied telling Warren that a woman could not be president. Driver, who was also endorsed the claim that Obama instructed the CIA to train ISIS, also appears to be a personal friend of Joe Biden, which clearly makes her an unimpeachable and unbiased source. As for Reid, an active and early pusher of the fictitious Bernie Bros meme, she's hated Sanders ever since and because he dared to challenge Hillary Clinton in 2016, which again makes her, of course, totally trustworthy. And a clown. But our winner is the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. In 2015, a group of 21 young folks aged 11 to 22 sued the U.S. government for violating their constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property by enacting policies that contributed to the climate crisis. In a mind-boggling 2-1 decision, a panel of the Ninth Circuit agreed with the suit's contentions that the climate crisis had brought the world close to, quote, the eve of destruction, unquote, and that, quoting again, the government's contribution to climate change is not simply the result of inaction. That is, it's also the result of what the government has actually done. And then, after agreeing with the plaintiff's argument, the majority threw up its hands and says they have to take their case to the federal government or the electorate. In other words, nothing to do with us. Thing is, the whole point of judicial review is to provide a remedy when people are suffering harms at the other branches of government. That's the whole point of it. As Carol Mullett of the Center for International Environmental Law put it, courts have a long history of doing precisely what the court here says it can't. This was not a judicial decision. It was a political one on the part of judges too cowardly to take responsibility for the meanings of their own findings of fact. And that very clearly makes them clowns. All right, turning now to the outrages. We certainly had enough to choose from. We had Tucker Carlson capping faux news months-long attack on the homeless with his own week-long diatribe against San Francisco and the homeless problem there, based all under the claim that it's all because of liberalism. Because, as we all know, the way you make people homeless is caring about them. We had the Tweety Pie gang just openly ignoring a court order to not deport somebody who was challenging their deportation, and worse, getting away with it because the court was too cowardly to use its contempt power. We had that same gang finalizing a rule to roll back clean water protections for streams and wetlands, affecting not only those protected by a 2015 rule, but even some waters that were protected under the original 1972 Clean Water Act, undoing pollution controls that had been in effect for nearly 50 years. However, our runner-up outrage is one I'm actually not going to talk about this time. It's one I was going to talk about, even though it technically hasn't happened yet. It's Tweety Pie's so-called deal of the century for Israel and supposedly for Palestinians, although based on what's known of it, it clearly isn't that. I was going to go over it based on what is known about it and what's expected. But the fact is, it turns out it's being released almost literally at the same time that I am doing this. So I decided I was going to hold off till next time when we could actually look at this plan and what it means, if only because with regard to Sweetie Pie, the actuality is often worse than the expectation. What we can say now is that based on what's expected, it is indeed the deal of the century for Israel, if the centuries involved are the 16th and 17th, full of colonialism, expansionism, oppression, and might makes right. But if you really want an outrage, you have to go to the source, the real source of way too many outrages. You have to go to Washington, D.C. And no, not to the White House, because many of the outrages emanating from there could actually be undone by a future administration. No, you have to leave the White House and go past the far end of the National Mall to the Supreme Court. You may recall that back in October, I noted a proposal to greatly expand the definition of who is a public charge under immigration law, and so also greatly restrict the number of people who could get green cards, cutting legal immigration by something like 2/3. There long had been an understanding that the term public charge, which actually had no specific definition under immigration law, but understood it referred to people who, as immigrants, would be primarily dependent on cash benefits for the government. Essentially, they would live on welfare. The White House wants to dramatically expand that definition to include non-cash benefits such as Medicaid, supplemental nutritional aid, or SNAP, still often known as food stamps, and federal housing assistance. And in fact, even using subsidies under the Affordable Care Act to buy health insurance on an exchange could be affected by this. Anyone predicted to use any such benefits for more than 12 months out of any 3-year period would be denied a green card. And note that this is a standard that millions, even tens of millions of our fellow citizens could not meet. The proposal has been under challenge in multiple jurisdictions with mixed results. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals had issued a nationwide injunction barring the change from being enforced while those suits were making their ways through the courts. But on January 27th, the Supreme Court overturned that injunction, freeing Sweetie Pie's thugs to immediately start turning away anyone they think is not rich enough or white enough to merit their imperial favor. It's hard to grasp the moral depravity of this decision. Injunctions are supposed to consider the idea of irreparable harm. Where is the irreparable harm to the administration, to anyone, in letting public charge continue to be understood the way it's been understood all along while the suits continue through the courts? None that I can find. On the other hand, the irreparable harm to the literally hundreds of thousands of immigrants who will be denied entry across that same time is clear and undeniable. There is just as clearly no denying that people denied the chance to flee the crime, the violence, the oppression, the hunger that drives people to go to a strange foreign country. There's no denying that people will die because of this decision. That a majority of the Supreme Court just doesn't care is an affront to basic human decency. It is clearly an outrage. And we're taking a break. And we are back. And we are back with an occasional segment that we call We Are Not Alone, where we remind ourselves that there is news of note in places outside our borders. We start in India, which has seen weeks of protests, which have resulted in over 24 people killed by police. The protesters, mostly but not exclusively Muslim, are opposing the Citizenship Amendment Act, or CAA, which was passed by the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The CAA offers an accelerated pathway to citizenship for Hindu, Sikh, Zoroastrian, Buddhist, and Christian immigrants in India claiming religious persecution at home. The claim is that the law is protection for people facing such persecution in their home countries, but the law will not bear the weight of that claim. First, for the first time in history of India as an independent state, and apparently contrary to its constitution, by the way, it makes religious affiliation a basis for citizenship, and it does it in a discriminatory way. You may have noticed that Muslim immigrants claiming religious persecution in their home countries are not included in the list of protected faiths. Also, it only applies to certain neighboring countries, specifically Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. It does not apply to other neighboring countries such as China, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka, even though in all three of those there is documented evidence of persecution against religious minorities. Christians, Buddhists, and Uyghurs who are Muslim in China, the Rohingya, who are a majority Muslim in Myanmar, and Muslims in Sri Lanka. The difference in those two sets of countries is not a coincidence, which becomes even clearer when you consider that the countries marked in red are majority Muslim with Muslim governments, and those marked in blue are neither. The law is part of and reflects a wave of extremist Hindu nationalism which has swept over India, where it has become commonplace for senior political officers to refer to Muslim immigrant workers as infiltrators or termites, and to move to create a national register of citizens requiring the production of documents to prove that you're actually a citizen, an obstacle that will of course leave out many. But you shouldn't worry, because Amit Shah, who is the Home Minister of India, has promised that the CAA will help anyone recover their citizenship who can't meet that standard, except, of course, again, for Muslims who are not covered by that law. The law has been challenged in the courts as well as in the streets. We'll see what happens. Another place that has seen demonstrations is Iraq. For 3 months, protesters all across Iraq, but particularly in the south, have been demanding the fall of a government that they say is corrupt and beholden to Iran. Between 600 and 700 protesters are believed to have been killed by security forces and militias in that time. Despite that official violence, the protests have been strong enough that Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi offered to resign in November, but he's still in place because no one has been found to replace him, something I frankly expect Mahdi knew when he made the offer in the first place. Those who have come forward have been rejected by the protesters because their various parties have ties either to Iran or some other foreign government, which is pretty much exactly what's being protested. Thousands of protesters have turned out every day in Baghdad, turning the central Tahrir Square into a sort of community, pitching tents and organizing meals, even having doctors and dentists offering service on site. On January 24th, separately from the occupation in Tahrir Square, a huge throng turned out in Baghdad to demand the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq. Many came out in response to a call from powerful Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, whose political bloc controls the most number of seats in the parliament and who actually has been supportive of the protests. But then Sadr reversed course and withdrew his support. He said it was a lame excuse that he said he wanted to avoid internal strife, which is a rather lame claim coming from somebody in the immediate wake of a mass demonstration that he called for. Now, it's not the first time in his political life that al-Sadr has suddenly switched course, but this one had immediate and deadly consequences as the very next day, Iraq's security forces moved against Tahrir Square. They fired tear gas, they fired live ammunition, they burned tents as they stormed bridges, streets, and a highway. Not just in Baghdad, in the southern city of Narizia, at least 3 protesters were killed by security forces when they moved to reopen a highway. Altogether, at least 12 protesters were killed and 230 more wounded in the violence. Without the support of al-Sadr, this broad-based and secular protest movement is likely to be crushed by government and militia forces. The protesters have vowed not to give up. They stayed in Tahrir Square that night. I'm sure more on this has happened since I did this. You should look it up. Meanwhile, East Africa has gone biblical. A plague of locusts have spread across Ethiopia and Somalia into Kenya. Over 100 billion of the insects, each of which consumes its own weight in grain every day, are swarming through a region already reeling from a 2019 that started with drought and ended with deadly floods. The invasion is the biggest in Ethiopia and Kenya in 25 years, Ethiopia and Somalia rather, in 25 years, the biggest in Kenya in 70. Now, technically, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, labels the current invasion an upsurge because only if it can't be contained and lasts for more than a year does it become a plague. But I doubt that matters to people as they see crops and pasture devastated in a region already one of the poorest and most vulnerable in the world. And worse may be on the way. When rains arrive in March, bringing new vegetation, the number of locusts could increase to 500 times what it is now. And it won't be until June that drier weather curbs their spread. Locals have employed traditional means of fighting the onslaught. They bang on cans, wave blankets, shake trees, anything to keep the locust flying and moving rather than eating. But the only effective means is aerial spraying of pesticides, and it needs to be done before the March rains. So what will it take to step up the spraying? According to the FAO, about 70 million in aid. Not billion. Million, 70 million, a little more than 1/3 of what Mike Bloomberg and Tom Steyer have spent on TV ads, about 50 minutes worth of our military spending. And the hungry of the world still need to beg. Oh, by the way, does this have anything to do with climate change? Yes. More bad news. A major earthquake hit Turkey on January 24th, leaving at least 38 dead and more than 1,600 injured. At least 76 buildings were destroyed and hundreds more severely damaged. The epicenter of the magnitude 6.7 quake was near the town of Sivris in eastern Elazığ province, about 350 miles east. 350 miles east of Ankara. Hundreds of aftershocks, one with a magnitude of 5.4, complicated relief efforts, which nonetheless saw dozens of people pulled from the rubble as 3,500 rescuers worked round the clock in sub-freezing temperatures. This is neither the first nor the worst quake to hit Turkey. In fact, one hit the same area about 10 years ago and killed 51 people. And in 1999, two strong earthquakes in northwest Turkey killed around 18,000. Now, I'm going to end this segment on this, and I have a particular reason for it being here. The 4th Annual Women's March was January 18th. Thousands turned out in Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Chicago, and other places. NPR referred to a smaller but passionate crowd focused on, as AP put it, issues such as climate change, pay equity, reproductive rights, and immigration. Okay, why is this under We Are Not Alone? To make the point that this is not a U.S. issue, not a U.S. campaign, not a U.S. effort. This is a world issue, a world campaign, a world effort. On January 18th, there were over 200 marches covering 24 countries on 6 continents. This is a worldwide campaign for women's freedom, by which I mean women's rights, women's dignity, women's autonomy. The issues women face may vary place to place, and I dare say they vary in intensity from place to place. But it still comes under one banner, one umbrella, one headline, one non-negotiable bottom line demand: women as full and equal human beings. It's one struggle, and we must not forget it. And I'm just going to end with 2 quick RIPs. Terry Jones, founding member of Monty Python's Flying Circus, died at home in Highgate, London on January 21st. He was 77. And LA Lakers legend Kobe Bryant was killed in a helicopter crash in Calabasas, California on January 26th. He was 41. The world is a bit darker today. That's it. We're done. We're out of here. I'm out of time. So I will see you in 2 weeks. In the meantime, you have the best time you possibly can. And as always, peace.